Hello and welcome to This Week in the Garden. For this week's episode, we're going to talk about beneficial insects in the garden. And this is a topic like the last insect video that I made that I could talk about for hours, and I have talked about for hours in a number of my classes. That's really how long it takes to fully understand it. When somebody says, well, what's a good insect versus a bad insect? It really depends on where you're at, which is an answer everyone hates. But the example I like to use is something like a paper wasp, where when they're near your house, they're really territorial, they can sting. Maybe they're a bad insect there. But then in your garden, they can be a good insect because they're going to be eating a lot of our pests like caterpillars. And that's kind of how it goes with a lot of insects. When they're convenient and when they're helping us, they're good or beneficial. And then if they're in our house, a lot of times they're bad. And that's just how it goes. But I'm going to try to keep this short and just go over kind of the three things that I think will help narrow down what our beneficial insects are in the garden. So the first one are pollinators. These are insects that help us to produce the fruit in our gardens, whether it's tomatoes or peppers or cucumbers. There's predators, which a lot of people are focused on when they're talking about beneficial insects that eat other insects. And while they do a good job, they're not quite as effective as a third group, which are parasitoids. These are usually tiny little wasps or flies that lay eggs inside of other insects, inside of our pests, and so they help to reduce the numbers. And it's something that a lot of people forget about. Now, when I talk about pollinators, most people will say something like a bee or a butterfly. And those are both great pollinators, but there's a number of other insects that are pollinators as well. Things like moths, which pollinate mostly at night. Then there's flies, ants, and beetles as well. So there's a lot of different types of pollinators out there. Now, when we're talking about a vegetable garden, our butterflies and our moths are oftentimes not really beneficial, and they're often pests, and that's because they end up becoming caterpillars that eat our plants. They don't really pollinate quite as much as bees. So in a vegetable setting, bees are really your most beneficial pollinators. And there's a number of native bees out there that do a great job of pollinating. And I have a link on our article if you're interested in those. But the two main ones to focus on are squash bees and honeybees. Now, a honeybee is just a generalist. It pollinates a lot of different flowers, but doesn't necessarily do a great job with all flowers because it is a generalist. So it's going to go from flower to flower to flower. There's really not much that you can do to kind of help honeybees aside from just having honeybees. But most of them are raised by people locally. They'll travel 5 to 8 miles, even further, depending on their food resources. And so for that reason, just trying to reduce your sprays to help to promote them in that way. But our squash bees are actually the ones that do a great job in our squash plants. So that's squash, zucchini, your watermelons, pumpkins, cucumbers. They do a really great job. They look just like a big bumblebee, and I have the image up here now so you can kind of see how similar they are. But these are a native bee that does a great job pollinating those plants. They nest in the ground, so you might see some bees going in the ground near those plants, and that's going to be your squash bees. And really the best way to promote our native bees is to provide food for them, so that's wild flowers. And again, in our article, I have a link to the Xerces Society. It's a nonprofit group that has a lot of resources on pollinators. So check that out if you're looking for some native flowers or native plants for our bees. But the other thing you can do is provide a habitat or a nesting site for them. A lot of our bees nest either in the ground or in stems of plants, in canes, that kind of thing, of weeds. Now, you don't want to have a lot of weeds in your yard, but you can make a bee hotel. And they're basically just little bamboo or little reeds that you put in a can. It's a great activity for families. So I've got a link for how to do that as well, if that's something you're interested in. So that's a lot of talk about pollinators. I'm going to keep it shorter on the other two. For your predators, there's a lot of insects out there that eat other insects. So many, in fact, that I didn't want to go through all of them, but I've got a PowerPoint presentation that I'll put in the article, and it's just a bunch of pictures, and it flips through them so you can see what are kind of in our area. The big thing I say about predators is it's okay if you don't have any. Predators aren't going to be in places that there's no food. And so if your garden doesn't have a lot of pests, you're not going to see a lot of predators. That's just how it is. So it's not until you start to have infestations of things like aphids or flies that you're going to start to notice predators, and that's okay. But to kind of help promote them, again, wildflowers help because it just draws in a lot of life. So native wildflowers help. And then if you put down some kind of straw or hay around your plants, it provides habitat. It's kind of a double-edged sword, though, because you'll get things like snails and slugs that you normally wouldn't have in your garden. But you will see a lot of spiders and ground beetles, a lot of predatory insects. So the last group are parasitoids, and this is a group that most people don't even think about when we talk about beneficials. But they're mostly wasps and flies that lay eggs in other insects. If you've ever seen a tomato hornworm, it's a big giant green caterpillar. Sometimes they'll have fuzzy white things on them, and those are cocoons of a parasitoid. These, like I said, are really small insects. You wouldn't even notice them probably, so we're not going to talk too much about what they look like. They're about the size of gnats. So if you're in your garden and you see a lot of gnats, could be that it's a parasitic wasp or fly. But to help get them in your garden, again, you have to have these pest insects. They're not going to be in areas you don't have any insects. But you can add in flowers. A lot of these little tiny wasps and flies need the pollen and the nectar from the flowers to survive. And so bring in flowers around your plants. I always recommend to get native flowers if you can, and the Xerces Society has information on that. Again, that link is in our article, so check that out. But our parasitoids are really a great thing. If you notice any insects that are kind of discolored, maybe they're slow, lethargic, or you find any eggs that are maybe turning black in color, that means they've likely been parasitized, and you can just leave those in your garden, and that'll help to complete those parasitoid life cycles. So that's a kind of quick version. I say quick, it's kind of a long video now. But that's a quick version of beneficial insects. If you have any questions, just send me an email. Of course, check out our article, and that's going to be on our website, where we'll have kind of the slideshow of pictures so you can see what kind of predators and other beneficial insects we have in our area. And if you haven't, make sure you take a look at our archive website. We're 9 weeks in now. So we've done a ton of videos, a ton of articles. If you've missed any, if you're new to this series, go back and take a look at those. But if not, make sure that you stay tuned for next time on This Week in the Garden.